Hi everybody, welcome to this video about freight transport. In this video, I will explain how to report emissions resulting from freight transport in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool. This video is divided into three parts. In the first part, I will explain the different emissions categories that include freight transport emissions. In the second part, we will zoom in on freight transport emissions factors. And in the third part, I will provide some advice on how to calculate travel distances. Calculating freight transport emissions can be relatively easy, but also a bit more complex if you want to be very accurate. In this video, we gathered guidelines that should help you make it easy, but at the end of the video, we also provide links for those of you that would like to take it to the next level. So let's start with the first part of this video, the classification of freight transport emissions. Emissions resulting from freight transport can be reported under 4 different emissions categories in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool. So we have mobile combustion, in-kind donations, upstream transportation, and downstream transportation. So in other words, emissions resulting from freight transport, so the transport of goods, can be classified across these 4 categories. So how do you know in which category to report which freight transport emissions? What are the meaning of these categories? Well, let's start with mobile combustion. All emissions resulting from freight transportation with vehicles owned by the reporting organization would fall under this first category. So all freight transportation done with your organization's fleet. These are direct emissions because the vehicles are owned by the reporting organization. So all emissions resulting from freight transport done with vehicles not owned or leased by the reporting organization, so transports done by external logistics parties or any other third party, these emissions would fall under one of the 3 remaining categories. If the reporting organization receives the transport service, so a transport in-kind donation, then the emissions resulting from that transport would fall under the in-kind donations emissions category. If the reporting organization does not receive the transport service, so it pays for it, then the emissions resulting from the paid transport would fall under the 2 remaining categories. Emissions resulting from transportation between the reporting organization's suppliers and the reporting organization's warehouses would fall under the upstream transportation and distribution emissions category. And remember, we're talking here about transportation done by an external party, which the reporting organization pays for that service. And also under this category, we have emissions resulting from transportation between the reporting organization's warehouses. And lastly, emissions resulting from transportation between the reporting organization's sites and aid distribution points would fall under our last emissions category, so downstream transportation and distribution. Let's consider a few examples. Our first example is the following. Humanitarian organization ABC orders humanitarian supplies from suppliers XYZ. The transport of the supplies from the manufacturing site of supplier XYZ to humanitarian organization ABC's global warehouse is organized by a freight forwarder with whom humanitarian organization ABC has a long-term agreement. Which emissions category would the emissions resulting from this transport segment belong to? Well, these emissions would fall under the upstream transportation and distribution emissions category because one, transport is done by an external party, so by vehicles not owned by humanitarian organization ABC. 2, it's a typical commercial service, so humanitarian organization ABC pays the freight forwarder for the transport. And 3, the transport happens between humanitarian organization ABC's supplier and its own warehouse. Let's consider our next example. Supplier XYZ transports the raw materials from its supplier to its manufacturing site with its own fleet, so the raw materials to produce the humanitarian supplies. Which emissions category would the emissions resulting from this transport segment belong to? Well, this one was a bit of a trap. The emissions from, well, basically tier 2 supplier to tier 1 supplier do not need to be reported by the reporting organization. In fact, the transportation and all the processing of raw materials up to the finished goods, this is typically included in the humanitarian products emissions factors, which is further explained in the humanitarian supplies video. Our third example is the following. The transport of the humanitarian supplies from humanitarian organization ABC's global warehouse to its regional warehouse, and later from its regional warehouse to its local warehouse. That transport is organized by a freight forwarder with whom humanitarian organization ABC has a long-term agreement. Which emissions category would the emissions resulting from these two transport segments belong to? These emissions belong to the upstream transportation and distribution emissions category. Why? Well, because one, again, transport is done by an external party, so by vehicles not owned by humanitarian organization ABC. 2, it's a typical commercial service, so humanitarian organization ABC pays the freight forwarder. And 3, the transport happens between humanitarian organization ABC's own warehouses. All right, moving on to our fourth example. Humanitarian organization ABC uses its own fleet to transport the humanitarian supplies from its local warehouse to the aid distribution point. So what's the emissions category here? Well, in this case, the emissions would fall under the mobile combustion emissions category. Why? Well, because the vehicles used are part of the organization's fleet. So as soon as the vehicles are owned or leased by the reporting organization, emissions need to be reported under the mobile combustion emissions category. Example 5. Let's now imagine that humanitarian organization ABC does not have a global or regional warehouse. It does, however, rely on UNHRD's warehouses. The transportation of humanitarian supplies from the UNHRD warehouses to humanitarian organization ABC's local warehouse is organized by UNHRD on a full cost recovery basis. So what's the emissions category here for the transport between the UNHRD warehouse and the local warehouse of humanitarian organization ABC? This would again fall under the upstream transportation and distribution emissions category. It does not matter that we have a UNHRD warehouse here. The transport segment is still an internal movement, not yet directed to aid distribution points and beneficiaries. Plus, humanitarian organization ABC is actually paying UNHRD for the transports. Example 6. Let's look again at an alternative here for the last mile. Let's imagine that humanitarian organization ABC relies on the logistics cluster's common services to transport the humanitarian supplies from its local warehouse to the aid distribution point, and the cluster offers this service on a full cost recovery basis. What's the emissions category here? The emissions would need to be reported under the downstream transportation and distribution emissions category. Why? Well, 1, the transport is done by an external party, the cluster. 2, humanitarian organization ABC pays the cluster. And 3, the transport is directed to the aid distribution point. Last example, Here we look at an alternative for the international transport segment. Imagine the humanitarian supplies are delivered by ECHO's humanitarian air bridge up to the in-country warehouse of humanitarian organization ABC. So let's imagine we are in an emergency situation. So the humanitarian air bridge is paid by ECHO, fully funded by ECHO. So what emissions category do we have here? Well, for this last example, we have a case for in-kind donations. So the flight here is fully funded by ECHO, so we are clearly in an in-kind donations scenario. All right, so now that we have covered the different freight transport emissions categories, let's have a look at freight transport emissions factors. The first point I would like to cover here is the scope of transport emissions factors. There are three types of transport emissions factors when it comes to scope. We have well-to-tank emissions factors, tank-to-wheel emissions factors, and well-to-wheel emissions factors. So what does this all mean? Let's start with tank-to-wheel emissions factors. Tank-to-wheel emissions are the emissions that are emitted by the vehicles when being used, so when you drive a vehicle. So tank-to-wheel emissions factors reflect these emissions. Well-to-tank emissions are upstream from tank-to-wheel emissions. So well-to-tank emissions are the emissions that are emitted before the fuel arrives at the tank. So this includes fuel extraction, oil refining, the transportation of the fuel, and in case of electrical vehicles, well-to-tank emissions are the emissions created for the production of the electricity. So well-to-tank emissions factors reflect these emissions. And you may have guessed it, well-to-wheel emissions are the sum of the well-to-tank and tank-to-wheel emissions. So similarly, well-to-wheel emissions factors sum up their corresponding well-to-tank and tank-to-wheel emissions factors. In the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool, we consider all well-to-wheel emissions, meaning we rely on well-to-wheel emissions factors. So all the transport emissions factors in the emissions factors database of the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool are well-to-wheel emissions factors. And if you want to add new transport emissions factors there, to keep it consistent, you should add only well-to-wheel emissions factors. While all transport emissions factors in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool are well-to-wheel emissions factors, the emissions from the mobile combustion category are split in two. Tank-to-wheel emissions are direct emissions. These are indeed the emissions resulting from the driving of vehicles owned by the reporting organization. They are thus directly emitted by the reporting organization. Well-to-tank emissions, however, are indirect emissions. These are upstream emissions, clearly not directly emitted by the reporting organization. So when looking at the results overview in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool, so as shown on the screenshot here, you can find the tank-to-wheel emissions in the category direct emissions from mobile combustion sources under Scope 1, and the well-to-tank emissions in the category fuel and energy related to activities not included in Scope 1 and 2. And this category falls under Scope 3 because it includes indirect emissions. On the other hand, for the three other transport categories, tank-to-wheel emissions are indirect because the vehicles are not owned by the reporting organization here. So there is no need to distinguish tank-to-wheel from well-to-tank emissions in the results overview. So you now know that the emissions factors in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool are all well-to-wheel emissions factors. Next point I would like to cover is what do the emissions factors represent exactly? What is their level of granularity? Well, this varies across the 4 emissions categories that we have for transport. So for mobile combustion, the emissions factors are expressed in volumes of CO2 equivalent per volumes of fuel consumed. You would just need to collect the volumes of fuel consumed for each type of fuel separately by the vehicles owned by your organization. So for example, how much petrol was consumed over the reporting period, or how much diesel was consumed. For in-kind donations, the emissions factors in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool are at a much more aggregated level. They are expressed in the volumes of CO2 equivalent per thousands of euro. So they consider the value of the donation. You have 3 emissions factors here by default, one for land, one for air, and one for inland waterway and sea. So if you receive some transport free of charge, you would need to define the value of the donation, and maybe you get a certificate from the donor, and then based on that, you can then enter the data. Lastly, for upstream and downstream transportation and distribution, there are 4 groups of emissions factors. One for road, one for rail, one for air, and one for sea. For road, there are different emissions factors for different truck sizes and regions. For rail, there are different emissions factors for different regions. For air, there are different emissions factors for different distances. And for sea, there are different emissions factors for different sea routes. So there are many emissions factors to choose from here, and all these emissions factors are expressed in volumes of CO2 equivalent per ton kilometer. So what exactly is a ton kilometer? 1 ton kilometer represents the transport of 1 ton of goods over a distance of 1 kilometer. Let's take one example. Imagine we have a truck transporting 2 tons of goods over a distance of 100 kilometers. How much ton kilometers does this represent? Well, ton kilometer is calculated by multiplying the mass transported, expressed in tons, so 2 tons in our example, by the distance traveled, expressed in kilometers, so 100 kilometers in our example. So we have 2 times 100, that's 200 ton kilometers in total here. So let's have a look at the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool. I'm now in the Energy tab, and this is where you will find the mobile combustion emissions category. So as explained, you have here different emissions factors for different fuel types. Then we have the Goods and Services tab, and in there you will find the in-kind donations emissions category. And so there you will see emissions factors for air transport, inland waterway and maritime transport, and land transport. And these are all monetary emissions factors. And then the last relevant tab for transport is the Transportation and Distribution tab. So in there you have one emissions category for upstream transportation and distribution, and one category for downstream transportation and distribution. So these both contain the same emissions factors, and there's quite many. So we have emissions factors for roads transport, and so here we have different emissions factors for different truck sizes and different regions. Then we have rail transport emissions factors, and here we have different emissions factors for different regions. Then we have air transport emissions factors, and here we have different emissions factors for different distances. And then we have the sea emissions factors, and so sea transport emissions factors. And so here we have different emissions factors for different sea routes. And we also have an industry average. Let's move to the last part of this video, which is about how to calculate transport distances. Remember, the emissions factors for the upstream and downstream transportation and distribution emissions categories are expressed in ton kilometers. So you need to know the number of kilometers, the distance, to be able to use those emissions factors. So how you get there is what I'll explain now. Ideally, you should get real distance data by asking your freight forwarders or fleet managers, for example. But this would most probably not always work out. So here are some alternative ways. In case of road transport, you can calculate road distances on Google Maps. In case of rail transport, you can calculate rail distances with the Eco-Transit calculator. In case of sea transport, you can calculate sea distances via, there's a lot of different online tools, and there's one example here on the screen. And the distances in these online tools are typically calculated in nautical miles, so don't forget to convert these to kilometers as required by the emissions factors. So you can apply a factor of 1.852 to convert nautical miles to kilometers. Lastly, for air transport, you can also calculate air distances via online tools. And again, there's one example here on the screen. In case of sea or air transport, you may have some smaller transport segments by truck to go from and to the seaports or airports. So what about these? Ideally, you should consider these smaller segments, but as these are most often relatively small, it is okay if you exclude them, especially if you're just starting with carbon accounting. So if you've watched the carbon accounting principles video, you may remember the two following principles. First, the big picture matters more than details, and second, be transparent about your scope. So with this in mind, it is okay to exclude the smaller transport segments and focus on what's the most relevant, the most important, meaning air and sea transport. But take note of that in your scope and aim to include these smaller segments in future carbon accounting exercises. To finish this video, we wanted to share some extra links for those of you that want to go the extra mile calculating transport emissions. If you want to further improve how to calculate freight transport emissions, we recommend you to check out the two links here. The GLEC framework can be downloaded from the first link. This framework describes in details best practices for the reporting of logistics emissions, and it also includes lots of emissions factors. Most of the transport emissions factors in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool, in fact, come from GLEC, but you have more there still. The second link would bring you to the Eco-Transit calculator. This calculator runs for free online, and it can calculate quite accurately for you the emissions resulting from a certain transport segment. It's pretty strong. This brings us to the end of this video. Thank you for watching the video. I hope it is now clear to you how to report freight transport emissions in the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool.